flexed relative to anatomical. Both knees are flexed relative to anatomical. My right hip, nothing obvious. So my right hip is in anatomical position, right? It's kind of straight down, okay? I'm doing my best to keep my pelvis level. I wouldn't put money on it, but I'm just trying my best to keep it here, okay? And then I do this. Now, I'm gonna have a conversation, we're gonna analyze motion joint by joint. In other words, if I wanna talk about the right hip, I don't care about anything other than the right hip, and my right hip is now abducted. Now I'm gonna have the conversation about the left hip. I don't care about anything else. My left hip is externally rotated. That's the one that gets people. How did my trunk bend to keep my functional circle of reach? My trunk bent to the left lateral trunk bending. As I do this, if I kept my trunk in anatomical and go along for the ride, I sway it back the other way, keep stuff up here level. Questions?
Can you go over the internal rotation?
External.
External, sorry.
Absolutely. So let's look at it differently. Cap and bottle, right? Open. Open. External rotation, internal rotation. External rotation, internal rotation. But guess what? I can have internal and external if I move the socket about the ball. So here's the ball, and here's the socket. So if you think about it here, if I go from here to there, I have external rotation. If I go from here to there, if I say, okay, well, how would I have to go back home? Now keep in mind, my pelvis is now in a new position, right? But I can look at my hip relative to the pelvis, and I can say, how would I have to rotate my hip to go back home? Wouldn't I have to internally rotate it to go back home? To line back up? Therefore, I had to externally rotate it to take it out of home. Internal, external. That's not easy. That's not easy, but that's why this is a level 10. Yes, ma'am?
So you said left hip external, right hip abduction.
Mm-hmm.
So why is one of them like abduction?
What a great question, because it's the position of my hips. It's the new position of my hips. So all of these examples so far, the hips were in the same position, right? So that's why they were all kind of ab and ads and interesting. But when I'm here, my hips are in different positions. Now my pelvis is going to move in the frontal plane. But now my hip globally is frontal, but locally I'm transverse for my hip. And thus why it's important to understand the difference between global and local references, right? So although my pelvis is moving in a frontal, because of the position of my hip, that frontal pelvis means transverse hip. You see it? What a great question. What a great question. Any other follow-ups? If both knees are on the ground, right, like this, so that would be ab and ad. That'd be the same thing. And if I had both hips flexed, good Lord, I don't know how to do this, but it'd be internal and external rotation. But in this case, I had one straight and I had the other flexed. Good stuff, guys. Okay, I got one more challenging one for you before we call it a day. Okay. I don't know who this is, but all right, Brian. Forgive my lack of flexibility. I is working on it. Start position. Finish position. Start. Y'all don't pay attention to the shaking leg. It's the air condition blowing really hard. From here to there. What was obvious? I'm not talking about my uncontrollable volitional shaking. What was the obvious motion? What did you want to talk, I apologize, what did you want to talk about the knees? I didn't move my knees too much when I did this. Oh, good, absolutely, the positions, absolutely. Guys, just remember to identify the new hip position, right? So my right hip is in what position here? It's flexed. So when I do this, it's not a global reference, it's a local reference. Maybe that changes your answer, maybe that solidifies your answer. There you go. All right, here's another way to try to visualize it without doing it exactly how I did it. You have to use your swivel chair though, okay? So what you would have to do is you'd have to fix obviously you'd have to flex your knee on the ground. My knee was extended, right? Anatomical position. Flex your knee and then swivel your chair and do this. It's the same motion relative to the hip and the pelvis. There's different positions of other things, that's why it looks different. But it's the same thing. If you swivel in your chair and do this, okay? I'll give you one more minute. Most of you pretty locked in on your answer? Is that your final answer? Okay, so let's practice taking tests. Watch this. If I say, now I'm going to abbreviate pelvic girdle rotations with PGRs, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We know what 5 is, right? None of these. Not. I did not realize I'd made that for you. Okay? Left pelvic girdle rotation. Right hip internal rotation. Left pelvic girdle rotation. And left hip. Right hip. External rotation. Right. Wait, wrong. Left transverse pelvic rotation. Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. Right transverse pelvic rotation. You got to win a sack of Halloween candy. Where are you putting your money on? 2. Okay, who's team 2? Team 1. Team 3. Team 4. Team 6. We got a problem, team 6. Who's team 5? Team 5 for the win. Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right hip horizontal abduction. This is internal and external rotation when I'm in a flex position. This is what internal and external rotation would be. Remember that? Right hip horizontal abduction. Hey, isn't it better to miss it now? And you learn from it, and then on the test, when I'm like, you'd be like, get that out of the way. I want real food. Chicks food. All right, guys, you have a good one.